You know, stereotypes can be a painful thing, but as we all know, there are times when it can actually be kind of a funny thing as well, especially when those stereotypes are grounded in a universal truth. You know, one such universal truth relates to men and their finicky personal relationship with their tools. Men and their tools. You know, even as I think about my tool belt and I think about my toolbox, my power saw, my cordless drill, there's something that just feels right about that. I want to start off this morning by playing a game called Name That Tune with you, and I'm wondering how many of you can recognize this song. That's right, I heard it. You can shut it off, Tyler. For those of you who don't know, this is the theme song to what was probably my favorite all-time TV show. Those of you who know who this is, who is it? This is Tim the Toolman Taylor, and he was the host of a show called Home Improvement. He definitely made a career out of making fun of men and their tools. It was a sitcom about the accident-prone host Tim Taylor, and he had his own cable tool show. The show really centered around the relationships he had with his wife Jill and their sons Brad, Randy, and Mark. Tim's co-host of the show, Tool Time, was Al Borland, and he was an older bachelor who was very devoted to his mother. Al and his mother were oftentimes the brunt end of Tim's jokes during the show. And when Tim and his family were unable to resolve their differences, they often turned to their next-door neighbor, Wilson, who you can see behind the fence in this picture. The funny thing about Wilson is throughout the 9 years that this show ran, you never saw Wilson's face. He was either behind the fence or hiding behind something else, but you never saw his face. The show originally aired in 1991, and for the next 9 years, tended to hover pretty close around the top of the Nielsen ratings. You know, one of the ongoing humorous aspects of this show was the many ways that Tim could find to injure himself with his tools. And for those of you who followed the show, you can probably think of some of those funny ways. A couple of my favorites were, probably my favorite was, he had this habit of supergluing body parts to either a wall or a table. This one episode, he actually superglued his head to a table. And much of the show was was based on how he actually got unglued from that. Another one that was very funny was he used a potato or half a potato to unscrew a broken light bulb and got electrocuted in the process. And now, just for the record, I have used that before. I have unscrewed a broken light bulb with half a potato, and it works very well. So if that ever happens to you, I'd encourage you to give it a try. But you know, there is just something about a man and his tools. But you know, there are certain times when we as men need to take stock of really what we choose to keep in our toolbox. A toolbox is only so big and it can only hold so many tools. Sometimes a tool will get worn out. Sometimes a tool will become obsolete as we get newer and better tools. And sometimes tools just become irrelevant to anything that we would ever need. Today we live in a culture that in some ways is similar to this. We live in a culture that to a great degree has fed men an expectation of what we need to keep in our toolbox. We live in a culture that to a great degree has fed men an expectation of what society expects them to be. But in reality, they set a standard that I wonder if any of us can actually achieve. You know, looking at it from a spiritual perspective, we need to understand that much of what culture says we need to be is also opposed to really what God would have us become. This morning I want to try and suggest that we as men have certain tools in our toolbox that may need to be replaced. These tools may be hand-me-downs, maybe they're tools that were passed down to us from our father or our grandfather. Or maybe these tools were even given to us by the world that we live in. This morning, I want to talk to specifically men, but also to parents and grandparents. I want to ask you the question, what tools do you have in your toolbox? And I want to suggest to you that it may be time to trade in some of our old tools for some new ones, because frankly, some of our tools may be obsolete. The first thing that we need to do is to evaluate the tools that we do have in our toolbox. You know, for many of us, if we are desiring to become godly, and especially godly men, we've been brought up to believe that a number of things are essential. We've been handed a toolbox. We've been brought up to believe that we need to be, first of all, a problem solver. We need to be prepared to fix any problem that we, our family, or even our church may encounter. You know, we may boldly say, bring it on, we can fix it. Whether it's a lamp that needs fixing, whether it's a car that won't start, whether it's a problem that our children may be having with a schoolyard bully, or even church problems, we're brought up to believe that we are problem solvers. Another one, we've been brought up to believe that we need to be a knower. We believe that we need to be supremely confident in our opinions, perspectives, and beliefs. While others may question and doubt, we've come to believe that being a man today is all about having the strength of your convictions and knowing the answers to almost every question that we could possibly be asked. Another tool in our toolbox is we've been brought up to believe, as Brian McLaren calls it, that we need to be a warrior salesman. Being a man is all about the conquest, we believe. It's all about launching crusades. It's all about taking our city by storm. And if we can't do that, then there's something wrong with us. Another tool that may be in your toolbox is we've been brought up to believe that we need to be a solo act. Any job that we can't do, any problem that we can't solve on our own, in some way represents that you and I have failed. You look at James Bond, you look at Indiana Jones, and a lot of the other modern-day heroes. You know, they didn't need a Tonto. They didn't need a Robin. They were a solo act. And we've been brought up to believe that that is what we need to be as well. Another tool that may be in your toolbox from a spiritual standpoint, we've been brought up to believe that we need to be a biblical analyst. We need to be able to dissect the Bible like a scientist would dissect maybe a fetal pig. You know, we've been brought up to believe that we need to gain knowledge through analysis. We've been taught to believe that knowledge is power, and in a spiritual sense, I think many of us have bought into that as well. You know, friends, I want to suggest to you that it's time to evaluate the tools in our toolbox. If you've ever read James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, or John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, or Brian McLaren's Adventures in Missing the Point, I would strongly encourage you to pick these books up and read them. These books speak about God's design for a real man. Each of these books speak about how God's design and model of a man really has been warped and changed by the society that we live in. You know, there's another book that we would actually like to give all the fathers who are here this morning. Unfortunately, we ordered them a few weeks ago and they didn't come in, but it's a book by Chuck Colson, and it's a book that talks about what it really means to love God. And we're going to have that book hopefully next week, and we'll be making an announcement about that on how you can pick that up. But it's a book that we have purchased for the fathers, and we know that you will be impacted as you read that book as well. You know, but if what we have just mentioned, if what you see on the screen before you may not be God's design for us, then what in fact is? What tools are we desperately in need of replacing? We need to replace our old tools with tools that work in the real world today. What are we going to replace these tools with? You know, I wonder if you've ever had a tool that has become obsolete. Now, I may be dating myself a little bit here, but I actually used to have a manual hand drill. Do any of you have one of those? The kind that you crank? Well, my manual hand drill was replaced with an electric cordless drill. I used to have a handsaw. Actually, I still do have it and still occasionally use it. But more often than that, I use my power saw. And I want to suggest to you that maybe the time has come to replace some of our old tools with better ones that are able to make us more useful in fulfilling God's plan. I want to suggest to you that instead of becoming a problem solver, we need to begin to see ourselves as a quest inspirer. You know, it's common for most men to want to be the answer guy. You know, the one that people go to when they have a problem that needs to be solved. There are times when that is in fact what we need to be. But you know, today's man needs to move from simply solving old problems, I believe, to creating a list of questions that will help the asker to begin their own journey of discovery. You know, if you think about it, that's really what Jesus was such a master at doing. He very often would solve a problem by introducing a completely new question. Or put another way, there were times when he would attempt to solve a problem by creating a brand new one for the person asking. You know, the Pharisees would come to him and say, how can we get these stupid crowds to know and obey the law as we do? Jesus doesn't directly answer their question, but instead he creates a new question for them to wrestle with and to answer. He says to them, seek first the kingdom of God. You know, in the same way, we need to inspire those around us to enter into their own quest. You know, many of you who have lived longer than I can attest to the fact that where you end up in life really has everything to do with how you got there. Who you become has everything to do with your journey. You know, someone once wrote that if your only tool is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as being a nail. You know, I was speaking with somebody a few weeks ago who was an immigrant, and they were telling me about their journey from the old country, as they called it, and how they literally stared death in the face a number of times simply to come to North America. They proceeded to tell me about God's faithfulness and his love and his watchful eye on them. And you know, after this conversation, it occurred to me that their words were not something that they believed because they simply read it on a page. But they believed it, and their journey confirmed to them these character traits of God. You know, the longer I'm a youth pastor and the more I realize that we do a disservice to our students and to our children when we spoon-feed them simplistic answers to their complicated questions. We need to be quest inspirers. Parents with kids, Sunday school teachers, Awana leaders, small group leaders, I wonder at times if we do a disservice to those in our group when we attempt to spoon-feed them steak. We need to learn to inspire a sense of journey rather than seeing ourselves as the end of that person's searching. That is a new tool that we need to put into our toolbox. Another tool that I want to suggest to you that we need to put into our toolbox is that instead of seeing ourselves as a knower, we need to become seekers ourselves. You know, oftentimes when we talk about pre-Christians, we're guilty of calling them seekers. And I wonder about that sometimes. Again, the longer I'm a father and a pastor, the more I have come to believe that Christians should be the true seekers. We believe that we need to be supremely confident in our opinions, perspectives, beliefs, and yet sometimes we alienate others in that process. You know, most of us, and particularly those of us who are men, have a difficult time admitting that there are things that we don't know. You know, one of my favorite bands is a group called U2, and 3 of the 4 members of this band are very socially active Christians, and the message comes through in much of their music. You know, not long ago I read a biography about the band, and particularly about the lead singer. Bono is his name. And I was fascinated as I read this book, and he spoke about the anger that was generated from the Christian community to a song that he wrote a few years ago. The song was called I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. And part of the lyrics go like this. He says, talking about Jesus, he says, you broke the bonds and you loosened the chains. You carried the cross and my shame, all my shame. You know I believe it, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. You know, people were angry that he would or could write a song that suggested as a Christian we may find ourselves at times without life's answers, that we may at times find ourselves feeling empty. Let's face it, there are some aspects of our faith that each of us are still trying to figure out. Each of us who are followers of Jesus, it's a daily working out of our salvation. We know that. Maybe some days we acknowledge that Jesus is who he said he was, and we know that he died for us and that his death represented a gift that we were being offered, and we know that that is a gift that we have received. But do you ever have one of those days spiritually where maybe you don't get it? Maybe you don't get what God is doing in your life or what his ultimate plan is. I was meeting with somebody this week who was going through a particularly difficult time in their life, and that's one of the questions he asked. He says, you know, I just don't get what God is doing at times. You know, maybe the fault lies in us for expecting that we will get it. Maybe in expecting that we deserve to understand. I am completely convinced, and I know many of you are as well, that the day we fully get it will be the day that we are able to look Jesus in the eyes. Until that day, it is all right to be honest and say that you feel that there is something missing, that maybe there is a void. And maybe we do a disservice to non-believers when we paint this picture of ourselves and Christians as having it all together. Dwight Eisenhower once said, and he's specifically talking about leadership here, but I think there's a real application for us as well. He says, in order to be a leader, a man must have followers. And to have followers, a man must have their confidence. Hence, the supreme quality of a leader is unquestionably integrity. Without it, no real success is possible, no matter whether it is on a section gang, on a football field, in an army, or in an office. He then says, if a man's associates find him guilty of phoniness, if they find that he lacks forthright integrity, he will fail in the message that he wants to communicate to those people. His teachings and his actions must square with each other. I wonder sometimes for myself, and I wonder sometimes for us, if we don't limit the work of God by being phony with those around us and communicating that Christians are people who have their act together. It is all right to be a seeker. It's all right not to have the answers. And it's all right to be plagued with questions. And to a great degree, the world is hungry to see that realness. Another tool that we may need to replace is that we've been taught, again, as Brian McLaren says, to be a warrior salesman. What we need to become is a dance teacher. Now, this may be a bit of a stretch for some of us, but follow this through with me. We've been brought up to believe that being a man is about conquest. It's about launching crusades. It's about taking the city by storm. And if we can't do this, then there's in fact something wrong with us. And for many of us, we in fact believe this. The problem with this is that we sometimes carry this to other areas of our lives where it shouldn't be applied. Parenting is one example. Another area is evangelism. You know, sometimes sharing our faith turns into something that sounds more like a military ultimatum or a slick sales pitch that's trying to sell somebody something. You know, today's world, people do not want to be won to Christ or taken for Jesus in a crusade. They don't want to hear a sales pitch for heaven. They need people like you and like me who are willing to simply come alongside them. Brian McLaren suggests that instead of seeing our role as being a warrior salesman, that evangelism today looks more like teaching someone to dance. You know, we as Christians hear a music that others do not hear. We hear the music and we know its dance rhythm. He writes, gently we need to help others to hear that music as well and to feel its rhythm and to learn to move with it with grace and joy. Maybe your warrior salesman tool is something this morning that you need to remove from your toolbox and replace it with dancing shoes. Another tool that may be in your toolbox is that we have been brought up to believe that we need to be a solo act, when instead we need to become a team builder. We need to be willing to admit that life is not all about us. The world doesn't revolve around what we think and what we want. We need to be willing to admit that we can't do it alone and that we need help. This past week I had a conversation with a very good pastor friend of mine, and he was sharing with me a difficulty that he was having with a leader in his church. When he asked me what I thought he should do, I don't think he really appreciated or wanted what I said to him. I told him that I thought his style of leadership was creating an unhealthy dependence on himself, and that part of what he was dealing with was the frustration of a leader who didn't want that kind of dependence on him. Men, we tend to do this. In order to help ourselves to feel like a man, we create in our relationships at work, our relationships at home, and even sometimes in our relationships at church, dynamics that are structured around other people actually being dependent on us. Things at work just couldn't survive without me. That ministry would fall apart if I wasn't there. If we ever say or think these things, I want to suggest to you that we have failed miserably in what we have been called to do. Instead of seeing ourselves as a solo act, we need to begin to see ourselves as true team builders. In my 20 years as a youth pastor, I can tell you with complete assurance that the strongest and best families that I have ever worked with are those who function as a strong team. The best and strongest ministries that I have ever worked with are those whose members have functioned as a team. Bruce Larson wrote a book called Wind and Fire, and he points out some fascinating facts about sandhill cranes, and some of you may have heard this before. But he says, these large birds who fly great distances across continents have three remarkable qualities. He says, first, they rotate their leadership. One bird stays out in front all the time. Second, they choose leaders who can handle turbulent weather. And then thirdly, all during the time that bird is leading, the rest of the birds are honking affirmation. Guys, none of us can function as a solo act. We function best when we are intentionally empowering those around us. That is a tool that needs to be in our toolbox. Another tool in our box that may need replacing, from a spiritual standpoint, we've been brought up to believe that we need to be a biblical analyst, when really we need to focus our energy on being a sage. We believe that we need to be able to dissect the Bible, like I said earlier, maybe like a scientist would dissect a fetal pig. We've been taught to believe that we need to gain knowledge through analysis. We have been taught to believe that knowledge is power. And let me ask you, how many of us have bought into that and truly believe that? If that were the case, then the Pharisees should have been the most powerful people back in Jesus' days. We need to move beyond our infatuation with analysis and knowledge, information, facts, and belief systems, and instead focus on what it truly means to be wise. We need to practice spiritual disciplines from a heart level rather than a head level. We need to become men who are characterized by depth in their spiritual practices and not by tightness in our belief systems. And then there's this tough one. We need to devalue our intellectual credentials and begin to emphasize and value more our character and integrity. I want to suggest to you that this may be a tool we need to remove from our toolbox and replace it with that of a sage. The dictionary, it's interesting, the dictionary defines a sage as someone who is eminent in wisdom, or the preferable definition, someone who is characterized by their wisdom, prudence, and good judgment. James 3:13 reads this. It says, Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. A wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. Someone once said that a real man has a magnet in his heart and a compass in his head. And my friends, I would suggest that that is how we need to define wisdom. A real man has a magnet in his heart and a compass in his head. You know, it may be time for many of us to take stock of what we have in our toolbox. You know, the world and society fills it up with a lot of things that truly go against God's standard for what it means to be a man, for what it means to be wise. And my challenge to you this morning is to take on the challenge of taking stock of what you keep in your toolbox and consider that it may be time to replace those tools with ones that will equip us to truly do the work that God has in store for us today. Would you bow your heads with me? Heavenly Father, I just am so grateful this morning that we have been able to